Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our July 26th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today we're tackling an important issue that's been receiving even more media coverage recently: water quality. Rick Robinson is the Conservation and Natural Resources Policy Advisor for Iowa Farm Bureau, and he's going to join us to share a side of the story that you might not be seeing or hearing in recent water quality news. Then we'll bring on Shane Wulf of the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship to talk about the progress that's being made implementing conservation practices that are specifically designed to address nitrates. Shane's also going to tell us about the boots-on-the-ground assistance that's available to those of you who are interested in having those types of conservation practices on your farm. We'll start with Rick Robinson, who sat down last week to chat with Spokesman Speaks reporter Zach Bader.
So Rick, there's been a recent uptick in water quality coverage that we're seeing, and unfortunately that coverage often downplays the positive progress that we're seeing in protecting Iowa's water quality. So help us out with what's the other side of the story here. What are some of the most recent signs, and maybe some of the most significant signs that you're seeing? There's obviously lots of signs of Iowa's water quality progress, but what are some of those most significant signs that you're seeing out there that Iowa's water quality protection is heading in the right direction?
Yeah, I think that the most significant thing is that Iowa has invested in implementation of its Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. And in the last legislative session, for example, legislators extended the funding period for Iowa to 2039. And so now we have over $590 million earmarked during that period of time for implementation of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. This is an unprecedented amount historically, and more than any other state around us. So we're doing great things in terms of funding our own policy and implementation initiatives. And already we're seeing more farmers over time participating in the field days, more organizations supporting local watershed projects. We're seeing more farmers, for example, adopting cover crops. There were only some 10,000 acres of cover crops when we first started the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, and now there's a comprehensive statewide survey that shows at least 2.18 million acres of cover crops in 2019. That was a 36% increase in a 3-year period. All these things together, the investments, the activity, the increased use of technology such as cover crops or a number of other things like that, it is expected by scientists that will lead to changes in water quality over the long term as we continue those concentrated efforts.
Of course, efforts to protect Iowa's water quality and protect the soil, that's not a new thing. Many conservation efforts have been going back for decades, right? And Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy that you mentioned there has been guiding the state's efforts since 2013. So talk a little bit about the track record, in addition to some of those great examples that you had there, the track record that farmers have, and again, the evidence that maybe we're seeing over even a longer period of time, that just the progress that they're making and that track record that shows that we're doing it yet again.
Iowa has a history of investing in soil conservation. Most of those practices have been focused on phosphorus reduction over time, really since the Dust Bowl days. What we found is that when they created the Gulf of Mexico hypoxia project, we had to measure from some baseline period of time. EPA chose a 1980 to 1996 baseline, and so most of the states have adopted that same time frame to measure their state nutrient reduction strategy progress. Iowa is one of those states that is using that same time frame. And we found that already we've had a 22% reduction in phosphorus loading in Iowa now compared to that baseline. And so we expect that as we shift and pivot to more nitrogen-reducing practices, that we'll see similar results as we have on the phosphorus side. So as we adopt the edge-of-field practices, the bioreactors, the saturated buffers, the water quality wetlands, spend more time on nutrient management and fine-tuning that, we will see similar results in the long run.
Of course, the nutrient reduction strategy has its critics, and some of those critics say that the answer is simply to have farmers apply less nitrogen. They say that we just need to have farmers use the maximum return on nitrogen calculator that's developed by Iowa State, and that tool is going to tell farmers that they just need to apply less fertilizer. Why is that particular tool and that logic in general, why is that flawed? And what's a better, maybe more informed way of looking at this issue of nitrogen, the nitrogen that's in our soil both naturally and what's being applied?
Well, many soil scientists say that the long-standing maximum return to nitrogen rate calculator, which estimates the economic return to nitrogen application rates with different nitrogen sources and corn prices, really doesn't account for weather and soil variability or changes and improvements in genetics and management that we've seen over time. That kind of information hasn't been updated in the MRTN. And that optimum rate of nitrogen for a given field can vary as much as 100 pounds per acre. The factors that affect that change from field to field, to farm, and also they vary from year to year. Extensive data that can increase our understanding of these variable factors has not been collected. But the good news is, I think, that scientists understand that we can put together an effort to collect this information to improve the MRTN so that farmers can use it as a planning tool as we move forward. And they'll continue to make money, we'll continue to protect water quality, and it's really a win-win situation if we can do that.
So, of course, Rick, Central Iowa receives a lot of the news coverage out there as it relates to water quality. And despite what people might read or hear, there's actually a lot of positive work that's going on here as well. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we've heard a lot of statements from a lot of folks, some activists, saying things like it'll take tens of thousands of years to reach our nutrient reduction goals, that it'll take millions of dollars to modify outdated water treatment systems due to ag influences, without any mention really of growth and demand for treated water from development, from businesses, from cities, or from climate impacts to naturally rich nutrient soils. And really, those same activists talk about their regulatory schemes. We've seen their lawsuits, and really all those efforts have failed over time. So now they're slowly realizing that maybe the collaborative approach that we've been instituting for decades, honestly, is the way to go. And we don't want farmers to be distracted from this rhetoric. Recently, we heard another example of how long-term water quality in the raccoon has been increasing in nitrate loads. And really, when you look at the Des Moines Water Works' own data on their website, you can see a 33% decline in Raccoon River nitrate concentrations since at least 2006. And that's as far back as their data goes on their website. So if you go and look at it, you chart it, you graph it, you analyze it, you can see at least a 33% reduction since that period of time. So again, don't buy that rhetoric that you're hearing. There's a reason for some of that. Some people still want a permit to farm scheme, and they're going to continue to say things like that. My message to farmers is stay focused on what your conservation needs are, stay focused on what fits your farm, stay focused on what fits your management, and continue to work collaboratively with your conservation partners, with your natural resource agencies, in watershed projects, and any way you can to get continued conservation on the ground, because that's what's going to succeed in the long run.
And we have a really good recent example here in Central Iowa of that collaboration. Talk a little bit about that effort and what kind of impact that's going to have.
So we have the Central Iowa Water Quality Infrastructure Project led by the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. And this is really an effort to figure out what practices go best where and bring those practices to the farmers. Bring the funding sources to the farmers. Ask them for their participation. Ask them if they think that those practices fit their farms. And if so, farmers can participate easily, and they've already identified contractors that can help build those structures, those practices. What it does is it accelerates the work that needs to be done. It gets it done faster, it gets it done more efficiently than having individual farmers try to sort through the system to find the best practices and the funding to get the conservation implemented.
So, of course, always the question with this is everybody wants to know what's next. And so how can we continue to see these kinds of improvements, Rick? I mean, these have been documented over time. How are we going to continue to see improvements? And why do you think Iowa is well positioned to continue to make that kind of progress?
Well, we have a long history, again, going back to the Dust Bowl days, frankly. Implementing science, implementing water quality projects, watershed projects, working collaboratively, coming up with new ideas. On the ag side of things in particular, farmers are always innovating, finding new ways and better ways to do what they've done. And whether that's farming or water quality protection, it really is the same thing in terms of farmers wanting to find better ways to do that.
You heard Rick talk about the collaboration, coordination, and long-term funding that's allowing the Iowa Department of Ag and its partners to bring conservation efforts and potential funding sources to farmers to help scale up conservation efforts more quickly and efficiently. Our next guest plays a big role in that effort. Shane Wulf coordinates edge-of-field practices for the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. Spokesman editor Dirk Steimel caught up with Shane last week to talk about how that's going and how farmers like you can get involved.
Hi, Shane. We want to visit today about your work on edge-of-field practices such as bioreactors and saturated buffers that can help farmers take on the challenge of improving Iowa's water quality. And we want to especially focus on the boots on the ground effort that your folks are doing to help farmers find potential sites for these projects. First off, Shane, why is the expansion of edge-of-field practices so important in improving water quality in Iowa?
Well, thanks for having me on today, Dirk. And yeah, one of the main reasons that it's so important that we incorporate edge-of-field practices into our conservation efforts is just because it's one of the critical components of the nutrient reduction strategy. We know in combination, it's going to take in-field practices, nutrient management, but then these edge-of-field practices are permanent infrastructure that can really do a great job at treating subsurface drainage.
And is most of it targeted at nitrates, the edge-of-field practices, Shane?
Yes. So these saturated buffers and bioreactors are primarily targeting reducing nitrates, but practices like saturated buffers can have habitat benefits as well. So there's some of those secondary benefits too, but yes, primarily looking at reducing nitrates.
How does your boots on the ground, and we'll call it that, but going out in the field, how does that help expand the number of these practices?
Having these folks out there give us the ability to capture important data, in order to design these types of practices. And so when folks are out there, they're having to scour up and down filter strips, ditches, looking for outlets. Most importantly, they also have to be kind of communicating with either that landowner or farmer. Hopefully they can sometimes provide some information. Maybe they have tile maps and things like that, but sometimes it's just a treasure hunt and trying to find some of those outlets. And then working all the way through that data collection and then bringing it back to the field office through the actual design process. So having those folks out there to do that is going to be critical in scaling up these efforts.
Are there things that your specialists are looking for as they scout for these potential sites for edge-of-field practices?
Yeah, some of the key things that we're looking for when those specialists are out on the field, we're really looking for tile location, identifying tile outlets. And then another critical piece here is determining the grade of the tile. We have some equipment, one thing in particular called a Tile Maverick, that helps us determine what grade that tile is laid at. And that's just critical because we want to make sure that these projects do not negatively impact adjoining crop ground and function properly. So that's really important. We evaluate soils as well. They play a critical role, especially in saturated buffers, bank stability. Those are just some of the things that our specialists are looking for when they're out basically evaluating potential sites.
So you're looking to get the practices on the ground without causing any impact on crop production.
Yes, that's exactly right. We want to make sure that we are taking that into consideration and not negatively impacting any adjoining crop ground. And one of the nice things with bioreactors and saturated buffers is the control structures that divert water over to these practices allow for the ability to modify the gates within them. And you basically retain your existing outlet. So if anything were ever to happen, you can pull those gates and your outlet will function just as it did before.
Is there a concern among farmers that installing these practices could damage fields or cause compaction with the equipment running over them to build a saturated buffer or a bioreactor?
One of the things that we work through in the design process is access to construction, and we try to minimize impact to actual crop ground as much as possible. But if we do have to mobilize along the edge of a crop ground or something like that, there might be a good opportunity to incorporate some kind of cover crop or something like that to help offset any of those potential compaction concerns or things like that. That would be my best suggestion there.
After they develop the plan for the water quality practice, how do the specialists work with farmers and landowners to determine the interest in the plan and the steps needed to implement it?
After we develop that plan, we kind of just provide a high level aerial image of where exactly that practice will potentially fit in the landscape, and then a payment estimate. And then, that's our opportunity to sit down with them, talk about exactly what this project would look like, what it would cost, talk about different conservation funding programs that could help offset some of those costs. And then, at that point, that's the opportunity to see if that landowner, that farmer wants to move forward with it.
Can farmers and landowners request an assessment by your specialist to see if there's potential for one of these edge of field practices, Shane?
Yes, absolutely. Any farmers or landowners that are interested in these types of projects, we definitely would encourage them to visit their local USDA service center. Either that or even visiting cleanwateriowa.org. There's the opportunity on there to request, basically some technical assistance on there. So a couple good opportunities, but yes, absolutely. We're looking for more and more sites all the time.
Is there funding and other resources that farmers can use to help them implement these practices, Shane?
Yes, yeah, there's several funding sources available to help offset the costs of installing these practices. We recognize that these practices don't necessarily provide any sort of financial return or things like that back to the farmer. And so trying to identify cost share sources is really important. There's funding through the state, through the Water Quality Initiative and the Senate File 512 Water Quality Infrastructure. There's federal funding through the Farm Service Agency and Natural Resources Conservation Service, various funding sources there. And then there's private funding sources. And a good example is the Iowa Pork Producers Association for farmers who have hogs and inject manure. So it's all kinds of different things available. And that's one of the responsibilities of myself, our specialists out there, is to help figure out what are the best programs that'll fit for producers' operation.
So the farmer can talk with your folks and they can help figure out which funding sources fit best and which would work the best in their plan?
That's exactly right. Yep. Trying to evaluate those cost estimates on what we, based off the design, and then figure out which program is going to work best. That's exactly right. So
can farmers often get enough money to pay for these projects without money out of their pockets?
Between a combination, we definitely encourage combining funding sources when possible. So it's often very common to combine state and federal funding to offset 100% of the costs of construction and materials. So that's again something where environmental specialists or project coordinators are glad to help out with.
Your boots on the ground effort, is this a long running program that you expect to see going for several years, Shane?
I do, yeah. I expect this to be something that's going to continue to grow over the next several years. We've kind of got these folks are starting to get trained up, starting to train each other, which is going to be huge. And yeah, it's something we anticipate seeing for the next several years.
Thanks to both Shane and Rick for joining the podcast. If you're thinking about adding some edge-of-field conservation practices on your own farm, you heard Shane say that the place to start is your local USDA service center. Or you can head out to cleanwateriowa.org, and we've given you a link to that site in the notes for this podcast episode. All right, we're near the end of this episode. Just 3 more things before you go. The first is a webinar that we are hosting on August 5th, which is going to answer any questions you might have if you've been approached about leasing your farm for any large-scale solar energy projects. Second is a webinar we're hosting on August 9th, and that one's going to give you a refresher on the latest regulations and exemptions that will apply to you as you're transporting grain this harvest season. And the third thing I'll leave you with is a reminder that the Iowa State Fair is back, and so is Farm Bureau Park. So if you're headed out to the fair August 12th through 22nd, please be sure to come out and see us. We're just east of the Varied Industries building, and we're giving away great prizes like a Traeger grill, a Fairway meat package, $500 in groceries, and more. We hope to see you out there. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it and that you'll join us for our next episode on August 9th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.